Sometimes, the truth doesn't announce itself with a confession. Sometimes, it looks up at you with a child's eyes and asks a question no one is ready to answer. The lunch crowd at Hawthorne House moved with the quiet rhythm of polished silverware, soft piano music, and conversations whispered over crystal glasses. Every table was occupied. Every server knew exactly where to be. Claire Bennett balanced a tray of iced tea and fresh sourdough rolls as if she had done it 1,000 times before, because she had. At 31, she had learned that grace often came from necessity rather than confidence. 6-year-old Ethan sat in the small waiting corner beside the manager's office with a coloring book spread across his lap. His summer camp had closed early because of a plumbing emergency, and after exhausting every other option, Claire's manager had reluctantly agreed to let him stay until her shift ended. Ethan never complained. He watched people with quiet curiosity, sketching little rockets and oak trees while humming songs only he seemed to know. The front doors opened, and the entire dining room shifted almost imperceptibly. Conversations softened. Staff straightened their posture. Daniel Harrison stepped inside wearing a charcoal suit that fit with effortless precision, followed by two executives already discussing numbers that sounded larger than most people could imagine. At 42, Daniel had built one of the country's fastest-growing investment firms, yet there was nothing theatrical about him. He walked with calm confidence instead of arrogance, acknowledging the hostess with a polite nod before taking his usual table near the windows overlooking the Chicago River. Claire saw him from across the room and immediately looked away. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the serving tray for only a heartbeat before she forced herself to breathe normally. "Claire," her manager whispered. "Table 12. Mr. Harrison requested your section again." She hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. Of course. She placed the tray down, smoothed her black apron, and walked toward the table with the practiced smile every customer expected. Before she reached him, Ethan wandered quietly from the waiting area, holding a blue crayon in one hand. He had been searching for the restroom, but stopped halfway across the dining room. His eyes locked onto Daniel's face. Daniel happened to glance up at exactly the same moment. For several long seconds, neither moved. Ethan tilted his head with the innocent concentration only children possess, studying the stranger's face as though comparing it to a picture only he could see. Claire noticed too late. "Ethan," she called gently, trying not to disturb the room. But the boy had already taken a few careful steps closer. The executives paused their conversation. Nearby diners looked up from their meals. Ethan smiled with complete sincerity, his voice carrying just far enough for every nearby table to hear. "Sir," he said softly, "you have my eyes." The words floated through the restaurant like a note from an old song. A few guests laughed politely, assuming it was another adorable thing children sometimes said. One woman smiled into her coffee. Someone quietly remarked that kids had wonderful imaginations. Claire, however, felt the color drain from her face. The tray in her hand slipped just enough for a spoon to touch a porcelain plate with a delicate chime that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Daniel did not laugh. He looked directly into Ethan's bright blue eyes, then caught his own reflection in the dark restaurant window beside the table. The same unusual shade. The same faint ring of silver around the iris. A coincidence, he told himself. It had to be. Yet something deep inside him stirred with an uncomfortable familiarity he could neither explain nor ignore. Across the room, Claire closed her eyes for the briefest moment. She had spent 6 years protecting one secret. In less than 10 seconds, a child had unknowingly placed it in the middle of the room for everyone to see. Claire forced a calm smile as she gently rested her hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice warm enough that no one could hear the panic beneath it. "Mr. Harrison is trying to enjoy his lunch." Ethan looked up at her with innocent confusion. "But Mommy, he really does." His small finger pointed toward Daniel's face before Claire carefully lowered his hand. "Sometimes people can look alike," she said softly. "It happens." Daniel remained seated, but something inside him refused to settle. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without losing focus. He had spoken before thousands of investors without missing a single word. Yet one child's quiet observation had left him searching for an explanation that refused to come. Claire apologized politely to the executives, guided Ethan back toward the hallway beside the manager's office, and disappeared through the swinging door that separated the dining room from the staff area. Only after it closed behind her did she allow herself a slow breath. She knelt until she was eye level with her son and brushed a strand of sandy blonde hair away from his forehead. "You cannot walk up to strangers like that," she said gently. Ethan frowned. He did not feel like a stranger. Claire's expression softened despite herself. "Why would you say that?" Ethan shrugged with the simple honesty only children possessed. His eyes looked friendly. "Like mine. Like yours when you are happy." Claire swallowed carefully. "Finish your drawing for me, okay?" He nodded without argument and returned to his coloring book, already focused on adding bright blue wings to the rocket he had started earlier. Claire remained still for another moment, watching him. Every year he looked a little more like the man she had spent 6 years trying to forget. The same thoughtful silence. The same habit of studying people before speaking. The same eyes that seemed lighter whenever sunlight reached them. She reached into the pocket of her apron and wrapped her fingers around an old silver watch with a worn leather strap. Time had faded the engraving inside, but she did not need to read it anymore. She had memorized every letter years ago. It had been tucked away in that pocket through every shift, every apartment, every birthday, every difficult month when tips barely covered rent. She had never sold it, even when selling it would have solved more than one desperate problem. Not because of its value, but because it belonged to a memory she had never found the strength to erase. Out in the dining room, Daniel watched the kitchen doors longer than he intended. His chief financial officer continued explaining quarterly projections, but the numbers blurred together. "Daniel," one executive finally asked, "are you listening?" He looked down at the report, then quietly closed the folder. "Reschedule the afternoon meeting." The table fell silent. "Sir, move everything to tomorrow morning." The executives exchanged puzzled glances. Daniel was known for never changing his calendar once it had been finalized. Yet today, something felt unexpectedly more important than another contract. As Claire returned carrying fresh coffee, she kept her eyes on the table instead of the man waiting beside it. "Your coffee, Mr. Harrison." Daniel thanked her politely, then hesitated. "Miss Bennett." She froze almost imperceptibly. "Yes, sir." He spoke with the calm tone of someone asking an ordinary question, although his thoughts were anything but ordinary. "How old is your son?" Claire answered without lifting her eyes. "He turned 6 in April." Daniel nodded once. "He seems like a remarkable little boy." A faint smile crossed Claire's face before fading just as quickly. "He is my whole world." Neither of them noticed Ethan watching quietly from the hallway. He smiled as he looked from his mother to the man by the window, unaware that two lives carefully separated for years had begun moving toward the same truth, one quiet conversation at a time. Daniel Harrison had built his life on one unwavering belief. Every mystery had an answer if someone was willing to look closely enough. By the time his black sedan pulled away from Hawthorne House that afternoon, the skyline of downtown Chicago blurred behind the tinted windows, but one image refused to leave him. A little boy with bright blue eyes standing in the middle of a quiet dining room, smiling as though he had recognized someone he had been waiting to meet. Daniel loosened his tie and stared out the window. His assistant, Rebecca Collins, noticed the unusual silence almost immediately. During every drive between meetings, Daniel normally reviewed contracts, answered calls, or dictated notes for the next acquisition. Today, the tablet resting beside him remained untouched. "Is everything all right?" Rebecca asked carefully. Daniel nodded once before speaking. "Tell me something. Have you ever had a complete stranger say something that stayed with you all day?" She smiled politely. "Not recently." Daniel looked back toward the restaurant, now disappearing behind the afternoon traffic. "Neither have I. Until today." Rebecca waited, sensing there was more. "There was a little boy," Daniel continued quietly. "He looked at me as if he already knew me." She laughed softly. "Children say unexpected things." This did not feel unexpected. His answer came almost as a whisper. It felt familiar. The word surprised even him. Familiar. He had spent years avoiding that feeling. His world had become predictable by design. Every hour scheduled. Every investment measured. Every relationship kept at a safe distance after one unforgettable summer years ago that had ended without explanation. Sometimes, late at night, he still wondered what might have happened if life had turned 1 degree in a different direction. But those thoughts rarely lasted long. Work always won. Success had become easier to understand than regret. As the car stopped at a red light overlooking the Chicago River, Daniel caught his own reflection in the window. His eyes, the same unusual shade people occasionally mentioned during interviews. His mother used to joke that no one else in the family had inherited them quite that way. He remembered being 8 years old when she smiled and told him, "One day, someone will recognize those eyes before they recognize your name." At the time, he thought she meant business magazines or television interviews. Now the memory carried an entirely different weight. Back at Hawthorne House, Claire finished wiping the final table in her section while Ethan quietly stacked his crayons into a small blue backpack. The restaurant had returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Her closest coworker, Melissa Parker, leaned against the service station with folded arms. "Claire, can I ask you something?" Claire offered a careful smile. "Of course." Melissa lowered her voice. "Did you know that man before today?" Claire kept folding clean napkins without looking up. "No." "Then why did you look like you had seen a ghost?" The question lingered between them. Claire stopped for only a second before continuing her work. Some days are simply heavier than others. Melissa studied her friend for another moment, but chose not to press further. Ethan ran over holding his drawing. "Mommy, look." The picture showed 3 people standing beneath a large oak tree. One was clearly Claire. One was Ethan himself. The third was a tall man in a charcoal suit with bright blue eyes colored carefully in crayon. Claire's smile froze. "Who is this?" she asked softly. Ethan answered without hesitation. "The nice man by the window. I think he looked lonely." Claire looked at the drawing for a long time before carefully placing it back into his backpack. Across the city, Daniel opened his office door, sat behind the enormous walnut desk that had witnessed countless life-changing decisions, and reached for his phone. He scrolled through dozens of business contacts before stopping on one private number he had not used in years. His finger hovered for a moment before pressing the call button. "Michael," he said as soon as the line connected. "I need you to help me find someone. Her name is Claire Bennett." Michael Lawson had spent 20 years uncovering secrets that people believed would remain hidden forever. Former military intelligence, now Daniel Harrison's most trusted private investigator, he understood the difference between ordinary curiosity and the quiet urgency he heard in Daniel's voice that evening. "Tell me everything you know," Michael said. Daniel stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline as the last light of day faded behind the buildings. "Almost nothing," he admitted. "Her name is Claire Bennett. She works at Hawthorne House. She has a son who is 6 years old." Michael waited. "That is all." Daniel hesitated before answering. "No, there is one more thing. I need you to find out why that little boy feels so familiar." Michael remained silent for a moment. He had investigated corporate fraud, missing heirs, and billion-dollar disputes, but this request sounded different. "Personal. I will begin tonight," he replied before ending the call. Across town, Claire unlocked the small brick townhouse she rented on a quiet tree-lined street. It was modest but warm, filled with second-hand books, family photographs, and the comforting smell of fresh bread she had baked the night before. Ethan hurried inside, kicked off his sneakers, and ran straight toward the old golden retriever sleeping near the fireplace. "Hi, Scout," he laughed as the elderly dog slowly wagged his tail. Claire watched them with tired eyes and allowed herself the smallest smile of the day. Here, away from polished dining rooms and expensive suits, life returned to something she could understand. She hung her apron by the kitchen door, placed the worn silver watch inside a small wooden drawer, and began preparing grilled cheese sandwiches with tomato soup. Ethan climbed onto a stool at the kitchen island, swinging his legs happily. "Mommy," he asked. "Yes." "Do you think the nice man eats grilled cheese?" Claire almost laughed. "I suppose everyone eats grilled cheese once in a while." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe he eats alone too much." Claire paused while stirring the soup. Children noticed loneliness the way adults noticed weather. Quietly. Naturally. "Why would you think that?" she asked. Ethan shrugged. His smile looked like yours before Grandma went to heaven. Claire lowered the spoon and turned away for a moment, blinking back unexpected tears. 6 years old, and somehow he still saw straight through people. The following morning, Daniel arrived at Harrison Capital earlier than anyone else. Instead of reviewing financial reports, he opened the folder on his desk only to realize he had not read a single page after 10 minutes. Every sentence dissolved into the memory of a child's voice. His office phone rang. Mr. Harrison, Rebecca said through the intercom. Michael Lawson is here. Daniel invited him in immediately. Michael placed a thin folder on the desk. I only have preliminary information. Daniel opened it carefully. Employment records, rental history, tax documents. Nothing unusual. Claire Bennett had worked continuously for 6 years, had no criminal record, no lawsuits, and no unexplained sources of income. She volunteered twice each month at a neighborhood literacy program and had never missed a rent payment despite living on an ordinary waitress's salary. Daniel looked up. Anything else? Michael nodded slowly. There is something interesting. He slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Claire leaving a community library with Ethan holding her hand. The little boy was laughing while pointing toward the sky. Daniel studied the image without speaking. He always looks at her before he smiles, Michael observed. Children usually do that when one parent has been both mother and father for a very long time. Daniel remained silent. Then his eyes settled on Claire's left wrist. She was wearing an old silver watch with a weathered leather strap. His breathing slowed almost imperceptibly. He knew that watch. Years ago, during a summer that had never truly left him, he had purchased it from a small antique shop beside Lake Geneva after joking that time always moved too quickly whenever they were together. He had engraved 4 simple words inside before giving it away. Forever is never promised. Daniel closed the folder gently. For the first time, coincidence no longer felt like a convincing explanation. Claire Bennett had always believed that ordinary routines could keep extraordinary memories asleep. Wake up before sunrise. Pack Ethan's lunch. Walk him to school. Smile at customers. Pay the bills. Repeat tomorrow. For 6 years, that quiet rhythm had protected the life she built with careful determination. But routines had a fragile way of collapsing when the past decided to return. 3 days passed before Daniel Harrison stepped inside Hawthorne House again. This time he came alone. No executives. No assistants. No business calls waiting in the background. Just a man carrying questions that had grown heavier with every passing hour. Claire noticed him the moment the front door opened. Her heartbeat stumbled before she reminded herself to breathe. She reached automatically for the order pad in her apron pocket and walked toward his table with the same calm professionalism every guest received. Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. Daniel looked up and offered a polite smile. Good afternoon, Miss Bennett. Neither of them mentioned what had happened several days earlier. Neither of them mentioned Ethan. Yet silence itself seemed to speak between them. Claire poured fresh coffee into his cup with steady hands until Daniel's eyes settled briefly on her wrist. The old silver watch rested beneath the sleeve of her uniform. Time had softened the leather and left tiny scratches across the glass, but he recognized every detail instantly. Claire noticed his gaze and instinctively pulled her sleeve a little lower. Is everything all right? She asked. Daniel nodded, although his thoughts refused to cooperate. May I ask where you found that watch? Claire's fingers tightened almost invisibly around the coffee pot. It was a gift. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. It is beautiful. She thanked him quietly before excusing herself to serve another table, but she could feel his eyes following her across the dining room. Not with arrogance. Not with curiosity alone. With recognition. Later that afternoon, after the lunch crowd faded, Ethan arrived from school carrying a small backpack almost as large as himself. Claire smiled as he hurried into the restaurant. How was your day? She asked. Ethan proudly handed her a sheet of paper covered with colorful drawings. We had family tree day. Claire unfolded the page slowly. Ethan had drawn himself beneath a large oak tree. Claire stood beside him holding one hand. On the opposite side stood another figure with bright blue eyes and a charcoal suit. There was no name written beneath the man, only a large question mark inside a heart. Claire felt her chest tighten. Why did you draw him? She asked gently. Ethan shrugged. Because I keep thinking maybe he is waiting for somebody too. Before Claire could answer, the front door opened again. Daniel had returned after realizing he had forgotten his leather portfolio beneath the table by the window. He stopped only long enough to thank the hostess before turning toward the dining room. As he passed the service station, a loose breeze from the opening door lifted the drawing from Claire's hands. The paper floated gently across the polished floor and stopped beside Daniel's shoes. He bent down, picked it up carefully, and looked at the picture. His eyes rested first on Ethan, then on Claire, finally on the tall man standing beneath the oak tree with familiar blue eyes. Daniel did not speak immediately. He simply handed the drawing back with both hands, treating it as though it were something precious rather than a child's sketch. "He has quite an imagination," Daniel said softly. Claire accepted the paper, but her voice almost disappeared. "Yes, he always draws what he feels before he understands why." Daniel nodded once. As he turned toward the exit, one quiet thought echoed through his mind with increasing certainty. Perhaps children did not imagine nearly as much as adults like to believe. Perhaps they simply noticed truths that everyone else had learned to overlook. That evening, rain settled gently over Chicago, turning the city lights into blurred reflections across the sidewalks. But inside Daniel Harrison's office, nothing could soften the questions that had taken root in his mind. He placed the child's drawing beside the old photograph Michael had recovered of Claire leaving the neighborhood library. 2 different moments, 2 different days. Yet the same unmistakable blue eyes stared back from both pages. Daniel had spent his career trusting evidence over instinct, but now both seemed to be pointing toward the same impossible conclusion. Michael Lawson entered quietly carrying another folder, noticeably thicker than the first. "I found something," he said. Daniel looked up immediately. "Tell me." Michael opened the file with practiced care. "Claire Bennett has no history of financial support from anyone. No hidden accounts. No trust funds. No unexplained deposits. She has worked continuously since Ethan was born. Every school payment, every medical bill, every rent check came directly from her earnings." Daniel listened without interrupting. "She never filed for child support," Michael continued. "She never contacted any media outlet. She never attempted to connect herself to anyone wealthy or influential. By every measurable standard, she chose the harder road." Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. "That does not make sense." Michael nodded. "There is more." He slid a small envelope across the desk. Inside was a faded photograph taken nearly 7 years earlier beside Lake Geneva. Claire looked younger, her hair moving in the summer breeze as she stood beneath a large oak tree. Beside her stood a man whose face had been accidentally folded beneath the edge of the photograph years before. Only one hand remained visible. On that wrist rested the exact same watch Daniel had once given away. His breathing became noticeably slower. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Inside a storage box that belonged to Claire's late grandmother. It was legally obtained after receiving permission from the family estate." Daniel continued staring at the photograph. "Do not investigate her any further," he said quietly. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Daniel closed the envelope with surprising gentleness. "I hired you to discover whether she was hiding something from me." He paused before adding, "Instead, I discovered she has been protecting something from the world." Across the city, Claire tucked Ethan into bed after reading his favorite story about a lighthouse that never stopped shining through storms. Ethan hugged his stuffed bear and smiled sleepily. "Mommy." "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you think people can miss someone they do not remember?" Claire felt the question settle heavily inside the quiet room. "Why would you ask that?" Ethan looked toward the rain tapping softly against his bedroom window. "Because sometimes I feel like somebody is missing us." Claire reached over and gently brushed his hair away from his forehead. "The people who truly belong in your life always have a chance to find their way." Ethan accepted the answer with the peaceful trust only a child could possess. Within minutes he was asleep. Claire remained sitting beside his bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing before quietly opening the drawer of her nightstand. Inside rested a bundle of old letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Every envelope carried the same name written in careful handwriting. Daniel Harrison. None of them had ever been opened because none of them had ever been returned. Claire held the letters for a long moment before placing them back inside the drawer. She had written every one during the months before Ethan was born. She had believed they had reached him. She had believed his silence was his answer. Across town, Daniel stood alone beside the window of his office watching the rain fall over the sleeping city. For the first time in many years, success no longer felt like certainty. Somewhere beyond those lights was a woman who had asked him for nothing, and a little boy whose quiet words had begun unraveling a story neither of them yet understood. The following Monday morning arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air, but neither Claire Bennett nor Daniel Harrison felt the quiet comfort the beautiful weather usually brought. Daniel sat in a private conference room at Harrison Capital with Michael Lawson across the table. Between them rested a single sealed envelope. Inside was the result of a legally obtained DNA test completed only after Michael confirmed every required consent and procedure had been properly followed through the appropriate channels. Daniel looked at the envelope for a long time before reaching for it. During his career, he had signed agreements worth billions of dollars without hesitation. Today, opening one piece of paper suddenly felt heavier than every contract that had ever crossed his desk. Slowly, he unfolded the report. His eyes moved across the first lines before stopping completely. Probability of biological parentage, 99. 99%. The room became perfectly still. Daniel lowered the paper onto the table, but he did not speak. He did not celebrate. He did not even appear surprised. Instead, he closed his eyes as dozens of forgotten moments quietly returned. A summer afternoon beside Lake Geneva. Claire, laughing as wind, carried her hair across her face. A promise that distance would only be temporary. A silver watch wrapped in a small gift box. Dreams about a future they believed would arrive naturally. "Are you all right?" Michael finally asked. Daniel nodded slowly, though his voice carried more emotion than Michael had ever heard from him. "The report only confirmed what my heart accepted days ago." Michael remained silent. Daniel looked out the window toward the busy streets below. "The question is no longer whether Ethan is my son." He paused. "The question is why Claire believed she had to raise him alone." Across town, Claire finished arranging breakfast plates before helping Ethan button his light blue jacket for school. The little boy looked unusually thoughtful. "Mommy," he asked, "can I ask something?" Claire smiled gently. "You always can." Ethan looked down at his shoes before speaking. "If somebody wanted to find us, would you let them?" The question caught her completely off guard. She knelt until their eyes met. "Why are you asking?" Ethan shrugged softly. "I had a dream that the nice man was looking for our house, but he looked sad because he did not know the way." Claire wrapped him in a quiet hug. "Dreams can feel very real sometimes." Ethan nodded. This one felt important. After dropping Ethan at school, Claire walked slowly toward the bus stop, carrying more memories than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, while organizing old kitchen supplies, she noticed the small wooden box still sitting on the highest shelf of her pantry. She had not opened it in years. Carefully lowering it onto the table, she lifted the lid. Inside rested every letter she had written to Daniel before Ethan was born, along with copies of every certified mailing receipt. Her eyes widened. One folded document had slipped beneath the stack over the years. It was a delivery confirmation from 7 years earlier. The signature on the receipt was unfamiliar. It was not Daniel Harrison. It belonged to someone named Victor Sloan. Claire stared at the name, confused. She had never known anyone by that name. At almost the exact same moment, Michael called Daniel with new information. "I think I found the missing piece," he said. "Victor Sloan was your executive assistant 7 years ago." Daniel frowned immediately. "He left the company without notice." "Yes," Michael replied quietly. "And according to archived office records, every piece of personal mail addressed to you was routed through his desk before reaching your office." Daniel's expression slowly changed as realization settled over him. For 7 long years, he had believed Claire had simply disappeared. Claire had believed Daniel had chosen silence. Neither of them had abandoned the other. They had both been living inside the same heartbreaking misunderstanding, carefully built by a lie neither of them had ever known existed. Daniel Harrison did not arrive at Claire Bennett's home with lawyers, security guards, or a carefully prepared speech. He came alone on a quiet Saturday afternoon carrying a weathered wooden box tucked carefully beneath one arm. The neighborhood was peaceful, lined with maple trees whose golden leaves drifted gently across the sidewalks. Children laughed in nearby yards while bicycles rested against white picket fences. It was a world completely different from the glass towers where Daniel normally spent his days, and for the first time in years, he found himself grateful for the silence. Claire opened the front door after hearing the soft knock. The moment she saw him standing there, neither of them spoke. There was no anger in her eyes. No relief either. Only years of unanswered questions waiting quietly between them. Daniel held the wooden box forward with both hands. "May I come in?" he asked gently. Claire studied his face for several long seconds before stepping aside, without saying a word. Inside, Ethan sat on the living room floor building a small model rocket with Scout sleeping peacefully beside him. He looked up and immediately smiled. "Hi, Mr. Daniel." Daniel smiled back. his heart unexpectedly lighter just hearing the boy's voice. "Hello, Ethan." Claire suggested that Ethan continue building his rocket in the backyard with Scout while the adults talked. The little boy nodded happily, completely unaware that the conversation about to begin would change all three of their lives. After the back door closed, Daniel placed the wooden box on the kitchen table. Slowly, he opened it. Inside rested dozens of photographs from 7 years earlier, the original purchase receipt for the silver watch, a faded map of Lake Geneva with small handwritten notes in the margins, and one framed picture of himself and Claire smiling beneath the same large oak tree that Ethan had unknowingly drawn so many times. Claire felt her knees weaken as she reached for the photograph. "You kept all of this?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "I thought you had chosen to leave." Claire slowly walked toward the kitchen drawer and returned carrying the blue ribbon tied around her unopened letters. She placed them beside the photographs. "And I believed you had chosen not to answer." Daniel carefully untied the ribbon. The first envelope was dated 1 month after their final summer together. The second announced her pregnancy. The third described hearing their baby's heartbeat for the first time. The last letter ended with a single sentence written through dried tears. "I hope one day our son knows you were loved before he was even born." Daniel closed his eyes. The weight of 7 lost years settled over him with quiet finality. "I never received any of these," he said softly. Claire nodded. "I know that now." Neither blamed the other. The truth had already done what anger never could. It had removed every wall built from misunderstanding. Daniel looked directly at Claire. "I cannot ask for those years back." His voice remained steady but deeply sincere. "I cannot ask you to forget how difficult they were. And I will never ask you to trust me simply because biology says I am Ethan's father." He paused before continuing. "I am only asking for the opportunity to earn a place in his life one day at a time." Claire remained silent. Then the back door opened unexpectedly. Ethan stepped inside, holding the finished rocket in one hand. He looked from his mother to Daniel before walking over with quiet confidence. "Did you fix the sad part?" he asked. Neither adult answered immediately. Ethan simply held out the little rocket. "My teacher says things fly better when all the pieces stay together." Daniel slowly knelt until he was at Ethan's eye level. His voice was almost a whisper. "You were right the first day we met." Ethan tilted his head curiously. Daniel smiled through grateful eyes. "We really do have the same eyes." Without hesitation, Ethan wrapped his small arms around Daniel's shoulders. It was the simplest hug imaginable, offered without conditions, without questions, and without knowing that forgiveness sometimes begins long before adults find the courage to ask for it. 1 year later, the first warm Saturday of spring painted Chicago in soft shades of green, and the neighborhood park echoed with laughter instead of questions. Ethan Bennett raced across the open field with Scout trotting faithfully beside him, his homemade rocket held high above his head as though it truly could touch the clouds. Daniel Harrison stood a few yards away, pretending to study the instruction booklet for a kite, while secretly watching every joyful step the little boy took. Success had taught him how to measure profit, risk, and opportunity, but fatherhood had introduced him to victories no balance sheet could ever record. It was learning how Ethan liked his pancakes shaped like stars on Saturday mornings. It was helping with spelling homework after school. It was sitting through science fairs, soccer practice, and bedtime stories without once checking the time. Claire watched them from a nearby picnic table, a quiet smile resting on her face. Nothing about their life had changed overnight. Daniel had never tried to replace the years he missed with expensive gifts or extravagant promises. Instead, he arrived when he said he would. He listened more than he spoke. He apologized whenever he made mistakes. Day after day, he earned trust the only way it could ever be earned, by showing up. Ethan suddenly ran toward them carrying the model rocket that had been carefully repaired and painted bright blue. "Mom," he called excitedly. "Dad says we can launch the new one after lunch." Claire looked at Daniel for a brief moment. The words still sounded wonderfully unfamiliar, yet completely natural. Daniel smiled with quiet gratitude, not because of the title itself, but because it had been given freely instead of requested. As they spread lunch across the picnic table, Ethan reached into his backpack and carefully unfolded a new drawing. This time the large oak tree still stood proudly in the center of the page, but the question mark was gone. Claire stood on one side holding Daniel's hand. Ethan stood between them, smiling wider than either adult. Above the picture, written in careful second-grade handwriting, were 6 simple words. My family finally found each other. Claire felt tears gather in her eyes as she looked at the drawing. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed the old silver watch. He gently fastened it around Claire's wrist once more. You kept time for both of us, he said quietly. Now let us make new memories together. Claire looked down at the familiar engraving hidden beneath the watch. Forever is never promised. She smiled before answering softly, no, but today is. Nearby, Ethan counted backward with complete concentration. 3, 2, 1. The small rocket lifted into the bright blue sky, climbing higher than any of them expected before drifting gracefully back toward the grass. Ethan laughed and chased after it while Scout bounded beside him. Daniel instinctively reached for Claire's hand, and this time she did not let go. Around them, families continued enjoying the ordinary afternoon without realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not a billionaire reclaiming a lost inheritance. Not a waitress discovering unexpected wealth. They were simply seeing 3 people who had chosen truth over pride, patience over resentment, and kindness over regret. Years from now, Ethan would probably remember the rocket, the sunshine, and the way his parents smiled at each other beneath the old maple trees. He might never fully understand how close they had come to living separate lives forever because of a single forgotten lie. Perhaps that was for the best. Some burdens belong to the past, so children can carry only hope into the future. As the afternoon breeze carried the little rocket across the open sky, Claire realized that destiny had never truly separated them. It had simply waited until every heart was ready to recognize what a child had seen in a single innocent moment. Sometimes blood begins a family, but showing up, telling the truth, and choosing one another every single day are what finally bring a family home.